Here's a guy to concede that the existence of God cannot be proven.
Yeah, I think part of the question, if I was asked this question, prove to me that God exists, what I would want to do with that particular person is I would want to ask what they're looking for in regards to proof.
Well, the first thing I would want is a definition I can recognize as coherent. Many apologists and theologians seem to define God as a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, and I have no idea what that is supposed to be. God also allegedly created all of space and time. I have no idea what that means. When I say that something exists, I mean that it has location in space and time. Existence seems contingent upon space and time, so how could the existence of space and time be contingent upon some prior existing thing? What would it even mean for something to exist prior to time? Once you establish a coherent definition, all you have to do is show some evidence that is consistent with it, and which is most falsifiably and parsimoniously explained by the existence of a God.
Because even academically in my own field, the word proof is this nebulous, problematic term.
I don't even need apodictic proof of something in order to be convinced of it. I just need evidence that is most usefully explained by it. With respect to God, since I don't understand what God is even supposed to be, I don't know what evidence for such a thing would even look like.
Because proof and evidence are not synonymous, and they're not always the same thing. And so, in some regards, proof will be based on what any one individual is looking for. And what might be considered proof for you to draw a particular conclusion might not be proof for another person.
When I say that a claim has been proven, I mean that I have seen a sound deductive argument for it. If a claim has been proven to me, not only do I not believe that it's false, I won't even be able to understand what it would mean for it to be false.
Proof mathematically is very sound, right? 1 + 1 = 2, and that's going to be true with a capital T no matter what the situation is.
It's not necessarily going to be true, it's just not conceivably false. After there are no more conscious minds to conceive of the idea of numbers, it will be neither true nor false, it will be meaningless.
But as a historian, truth is a probability issue. It's an inference to the best explanation. And so we're looking for things on a higher probability of whether they actually happened or a lower probability based on a number of intervening factors.
Which is why you could never make a historical case that a miracle ever occurred. As Bart Ehrman has said, since historians can only ever discern what most probably happened, and a miracle, pretty much by definition, is the least probable type of occurrence, you could never make the case that a miracle happened using the epistemic tools available to historians.
And so if we're looking for an answer to prove God exists, I think the question kind of sets up the terms to maybe leave that person wanting to begin with. So what I want to do is actually find out what that person means by proof and try to provide something that would potentially speak into what they're looking for in particular. Maybe the question is existential. Maybe they're looking for a God who they can feel knows them intimately and loves them.
Why would someone looking for proof of God be looking for that? That's a weird thing for someone on the fence about whether a God exists to look for. Whether I believe in a God or not has nothing to do with whether he knows me and loves me. I consider that a totally separate question, and a question I would never ask because I would see no reason to care.
And maybe the question that they're looking for is scientific, and they're looking for a design answer. How do we look at the world around us and look into the details of the cell or biology, chemistry?
How exactly do you tell the difference between a designed thing and an undesigned thing? Apologists just seem to believe that if something is complex and has a very specific consequence, that this is evidence that the complex thing was consciously made for the purpose of having that consequence. This is a giant non sequitur. Also, given that theists believe that literally everything is the result of being made either by God's intelligence or by human intelligence, we have no examples of things that are not the result of intelligence to use as a basis of comparison. How can we infer that something is made by an intelligence if we have no examples of what something that is not made by an intelligence looks like? How could we tell the difference? It would make no sense to say that if there were no God, everything would be chaotic, because theists believe that even the chaotic aspects of nature were designed by God. Even if everything were chaotic, that would not falsify the existence of a God to a theist, so the design argument is effectively non-falsifiable and therefore meaningless.
And find evidence of something beyond matter and motion that gives an answer. Or maybe it's philosophical. Maybe they're trying to answer philosophical questions that are being posed to them or that they are encountering about a good God in a world that is complicated and all of these things. So there isn't necessarily one silver bullet in terms of a proof for God.
Nor is there any evidence of God that is even remotely convincing.
Because if you have 100 people in a room, you have 100 different avenues that they might be looking for that could very well give them what they're searching in terms of who they think God could be. And the answers to those questions are going to show them who God is, but it's different avenues to the same destination.
And every one of them is a dead end.
So good and so insightful. I'm picturing myself and my husband right now, because all I need is to feel God's presence, but he needs to know that the biblical texts are accurate and provable. So very interesting. Okay, here's the next question from our young millennials. I mean, I guess they're not as young anymore, and our young Gen Z, sorry, millennials and Gen Z. How could a good God allow evil and suffering in the world? And I hear their heart on that question, because they are inundated with terrible news constantly on places like social media.
There are a few standard answers to this. One is human free will. I find this unconvincing because I'm not convinced free will exists, and even if it does exist, I don't see why it is so valuable that it makes suffering worthwhile. Also, this is not even in the Bible. This is a later inference that theologians have read into the text. Another answer apologists give is that God has sufficient reasons for allowing suffering that are good enough to make up for it. But the only way such reasons could excuse the suffering that is allowed in order to achieve them is if this supposedly all-powerful God does not have the power to achieve them without allowing the suffering.
Yeah, well, that is arguably the hardest and most pressing apologetic question there is. Because ultimately, the very tidy philosophical and theological answer isn't the right answer sometimes. Sometimes the right answer to the wrong question is the wrong answer. Because I've encountered situations where someone has brought up a variation of the problem of evil to me, and I've just felt uneasy about maybe the tenure that they're coming at with the question, kind of
The tenure?
the character that maybe is behind the scenes, and asking them, that's a great question. Why are you asking that question in particular?
I suspect that what he means is that people who ask this question are motivated by some kind of bitterness. That's not why I ask the question. I ask the question of why a God who is allegedly all-loving and all-powerful would allow suffering, because it looks like a contradiction to me, and I'm seeking to resolve that contradiction.
And finding out, once again, like the previous question related to it, they're personally hurting. And so in that sense, I could give a tidy answer about, if you're positing that something is good, you're positing that there's an objective good and evil, and if there's an objective good and evil, then you're positing an objective law, and an objective law needs an objective lawgiver. So
no, I'm not. Pointing out that God's apparent behavior, if he exists, isn't consistent with his stipulated morality in no way concedes that God exists or that the moral rules in question are objective. If I claim that there is a God who says that the existence of trees is evil, and you, quite reasonably, ask why it is that such a God would allow trees to exist, are you implying that this alleged God's alleged rule that trees are evil is objectively true? Obviously not.
Where do we find the groundwork for an objective lawgiver to begin with? Otherwise, you may not like certain things, but to say they ought not to happen is actually an ethical leap to an objective reality that you may or may not have groundwork for.
When I ask why a perfectly good and all-powerful God would allow the existence of things he opposes, I'm not saying that they ought not happen in a moral sense. I'm saying I can't make any sense out of why he would allow such a thing. I don't even have to agree that the things he opposes are bad in order to ask why God allows them. I don't agree that homosexuality is bad, but it still makes no sense to me why a God who allegedly does see it as bad would allow people to have same-sex attractions.
But if that person is struggling because a family member of theirs has cancer, then that particular maybe tidy, tied up in a nice bow answer is not going to speak to them whatsoever. And so that's why that's the hardest question, because there are actually very good answers to it.
Then why haven't you given any?
But often it doesn't speak to the person in front of you, because questions have questioners that sit behind them. And one of the pitfalls of my chosen field of ministry, apologetics, is that sometimes we give answers where we talk at people rather than with people, and there's a danger to that.
So you have to manipulate them emotionally to get your message across.
Because the Christian faith isn't just an intellectual assent, right? It's a personal relationship. And that should also be played out in the answers that we give. So in one sense, I would say that I talk to a lot of people who go through that particular issue, and sometimes they assume that removing God from the equation is the answer because they're wrestling with this good God, bad world. How do I put these two things together? Unfortunately, though, I think if you remove God from the picture, you're removing an essential component of even raising the objection to begin with. Like I said before, where are we getting these ideas that this is evil and that this other thing is good and that you should be doing situation B above situation A? And ultimately, I think the Christian worldview is unique in that the God of the Bible is not the God of deism who creates and just kind of lets the clockwork dials and switches go into place and looks from afar, viewing what's going on, but actually enters into the creation and experiences pain and suffering and uncertainty and ultimately murder.
He experiences execution. Given how often God prescribes execution, it's hard to see why a Christian would conflate that with murder.
And so in that sense, the God of the Bible can truly identify with the person who is suffering, because the God of the Bible looks at us when we say, I don't get it. I'm hurting. God, what's going on? And he can say, I understand that. You don't like evil. Me neither. Look at what it did to my son.
If the whole point of Jesus incarnating was for him to be crucified for our sins, why would that be evil?
And there's an aspect of that which I don't think you can find in other worldview perspectives to the same degree.
When you look at the worldview of other world religions, how is Christianity different? And how do we answer the assumption that all roads lead to God equally, and that Jesus, his claims weren't exclusive, that he is the only way to God? How do we unpack the different world religions and understand that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people assume that Christianity is exclusive and that other worldviews aren't.
Who assumes that?
And unfortunately, that's not the case. Every worldview is going to be exclusive at some point.
Not every worldview says everyone will experience eternal torment that they totally deserve, except for us.
Because all worldviews are making grand claims about whether that's the origin of the universe or about how to be a good person or how to seek something that's desirable after this particular time that we experience on earth. And even an atheistic worldview is going to say that a religious worldview is wrong.
Not necessarily. If the religion is not a theistic one, it would not be inconsistent with atheism.
And so all worldviews are going to be exclusive. Even the inclusivistic ones who attempt to grab bag all the parts that they like of any one particular religion, they're going to exclude the exclusivists.
Not from their concept of the afterlife if they have one. That seems to be the point of the question of whether Jesus is the only way to God. Christian Universalists, for example, while they may believe that people only come to God through Jesus, they also believe that everyone eventually will.
And so in that sense, they themselves are likewise exclusivistic. So I think we can stop pretending that there is such thing as neutrality and that we can own the fact that everybody is going to push back on something, even if it's pushing back on the exclusivists.
When people express disagreement with exclusivism in Christianity, they usually complain specifically about the idea that the only way to get to heaven is by being Christian. They don't have a problem with the fact that worldviews disagree with other worldviews or have views that define them as being of one particular worldview and not another.
So that's, I think, a good place to start. But then the kind of place to go on from there is in looking at the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is different in that a lot of the other worldviews, if not all of the other worldviews, have some form of moralistic ideal to be able to live up to a standard. That can be emotional, that can be intellectual, that can be pragmatic, but if it's telling you, be the best at doing this thing, or be the best at feeling this thing, or being the best at learning this thing, it's all put on your shoulders. And the Christian worldview, I sometimes say, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK with Speak Life Ministries, he has this version that I've taken and adapted where he says all worldviews are some form of survival of the fittest. But in Christianity, the difference is that the fittest steps down and sacrifices himself for the survival of the weakest. And that switching of motivations really does make Christianity unique, in that it's not about you doing the best or feeling the best or thinking the best, because those things are never going to live up to God's standards. Marred by sin, all of our thinking and feeling and doing is always going to be insufficient.
What's the point of a standard that is impossible to meet? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.